first criminal president. Donald Trump didn't do it alone. And the point I'm making is that our media is so tied up with, so it has so heavily embraced, is so bound to the idea of both sides-ism. If you're going to criticize a Republican, you have to criticize a Democrat. That they have been ignoring what we actually know about actual crimes, including crimes that I would say can be reasonably elevated to the level of treason by at least 2 Republican presidents, crimes committed just to win office. Now, you know, Jack Smith et al. Are looking into Donald Trump. There was one of the prosecutors was seen this morning going into the Miami federal courthouse. Apparently, there's a grand jury that's been impaneled down there. There might be one in Palm Beach County. We don't know. I don't know for sure about that one. There is, you know, obviously the one in D.C. 3 grand juries. This might be very problematic for Donald Trump. And, you know, he's squealing like a stuck pig. Terrible metaphor, isn't that? But, you know, evocative. Anyhow, but the media is not putting this in context. This is not the first time we've had a criminal president. Now, I get it that we've only known this for sure for a while. It was only 10 years ago, it was in 2013, that the LBJ Library finally released the tapes that Lyndon Johnson had recorded. Now, you know, Richard Nixon bugged the White House, you know, taped the White House, but he did it because Lyndon Johnson he got the idea from LBJ. And LBJ had recorded all his own phone conversations. And in 1968, Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, LBJ's vice president, was running against Richard Nixon for president of the United States in the 68 election. And Humphrey was way ahead. In fact, right up until Election Day, the polls were showing that Humphrey was going to win. Nixon's victory was a huge upset. Nobody expected it. And in the middle of this, Lyndon Johnson, actually Humphrey was involved in it, he was going to take credit for it, had negotiated a deal between South Vietnam and Hanoi to end the Vietnam War in 1968. Keep in mind, the war didn't actually end until 74, you know, when Jerry Ford was president. So Nixon learned about this, and he called a meeting in his apartment in New York City with Anna Chennault, who was an old Republican operative who had once been part of what they called the China lobby. You know, she had worked with Nixon to open up China. Nixon was the first president to go to China and that kind of stuff. So maybe the first president ever. And Nixon and Chennault in his apartment in New York City made a phone call to the ambassador from South Vietnam and said, you know, if you will hold off on signing this peace deal that we've negotiated until after the election, I, Nixon, will give you all kinds of freebies. I'll make you rich. I'll do good by you. And the Vietnamese did it. The South Vietnamese, they pulled out of the peace talks. They refused to sign the agreement that had already been negotiated, thus hurting Humphrey and helping Nixon win the 1968 election. And this is the phone call. It's playing out of my computer here, Sean. This is the phone call that LBJ made to Senator Everett Dirksen, the senior Republican in the United States Senate, kind of the elder statesman of the Senate. I believe he was the Senate Majority Leader at the time as well. But here's the call.
Here's the latest information we got. The agent says that they just talked to the boss in New Mexico. And that he says that you must hold out. Just hold on until after the election. We know what Chew is saying to them out there. Yeah. We're pretty well informed on both ends. Now, I'm reading their hand, Everett. I don't want to get this in the campaign. That's right. And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason. I know.
I know. So Nixon committed treason. We learned that 10 years ago in 2013. How many times have you seen it in the media since then? I've seen it once. Then comes Reagan. You know, Reagan wanted to beat Jimmy Carter in 1980. Jimmy Carter was way ahead throughout most of the election. And, you know, a year earlier, the 52 American hostages had been taken in Iran by the so-called students. President Bonnie Sauter, candidate Bonnie Sauter, ran for election in August of 1980 in Iran for president. And he ran on a platform of freeing the hostages. And he won on that platform. And as president, he worked out a deal with Jimmy Carter to free the hostages, and they were going to be freed in October of 1980. And it would have cemented Carter's win for the White House. Well, again, the Reagan campaign learned about this and intervened. They reached out to the Ayatollah and they said, you know, if you will hold off on this. This is a virtual identical play to what happened with Nixon. And they reached out to the Ayatollah. Excuse me. They reached out. Yeah, and Reagan reached out to the Ayatollah and said, you know, do this. And Reagan, literally the minute he put his hand on the Bible to be sworn into office was the minute that the Iranians released the hostages, because they needed spare parts. They had American-made weaponry, and the Reagan campaign said, we will give these to you if you will hold the hostages until after the election. And they did. They held them until the minute that the hostages were released. President Bonnie Sauter came to the United States back about 10 years ago and told us this. It was published in the Christian Science Monitor. It was picked up in a few other media. He was shouting it from the rooftops that he came to the United States to reveal the connection between Khomeiniism and Reaganism, and that Reagan had cut a deal with Khomeini, and that's how he won the 1980 election. Well, this was considered a conspiracy theory, even though it was confirmed by the president of Iran 10 years ago. It was still considered a conspiracy theory by the mainstream media until 3 months ago. 3 months ago, in March of this year, Ben Barnes, the guy who was the lieutenant governor of Texas at one point, he was the Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives, Republican operative. He was the guy who, on behalf of Congressman George H.W. Bush, got George W. Bush into the Texas Air National Guard so he wouldn't have to go to Vietnam. Ben Barnes came out and said, I went to Paris with John Connally, the former Republican governor, on behalf of the Reagan campaign to cut that deal with the Iranians. And he said, history needs to know that this happened. He's 85 years old now. He says, I think it's so significant, and I guess knowing that the end is near for President Carter put it in my mind more and more and more. I just feel like we've got to get it down some way. So we've known for 3 months, for sure, that Reagan committed treason to become president, the same way Nixon did. And yet, again, it's like this both sidesism. If the media can't point to a crime that a Democrat committed, they're not going to talk about a crime a Republican committed. Bottom line here, if those two criminals had been outed or prosecuted or even treated badly by history and the newspapers over the years, Trump may not have thought it was a good idea to cut a deal with the Russians to become president. He may not have reached out to Putin and said, please intervene in the 2016 election. He might not have taken top secret documents and through Jared Kushner, shoved them in the face of Mohammed bin Salman to let him stage a palace coup and take over Saudi Arabia. He might not have sent Rand Paul on a secret mission to deliver top secret documents to Vladimir Putin's people in 2017. But he did.